I was working as a youth pastor, and the first graduating class at this church I took over as a youth pastor, all but one of them, by the time we were done with the Christmas break of their freshman year in college, they walked away from the faith. When I'm explaining the truth of Christianity to young people, I've got to be able to balance those two things. So its truth is going to be important, but goodness is going to be also equally important.
Welcome to the Maven Parent Podcast, and we have a special episode today, and it has nothing to do with our guest.
That's
the way to start. Hey, this is that comment right there just shows you how dear you are to me, Jim.
The sarcasm?
The sarcasm, yes, exactly. Yeah. But we are actually recording this podcast in front of a live audience at the 2024 Southern California MAVEN Conference.
Good.
And we would love to hear, if there's anyone out there listening right now, go ahead and just make a little noise so our audience can hear. Okay.
All four of them.
All right, yeah, hundreds of them, thousands, a sea of people right now listening to the podcast. But no, it is actually a special podcast because we have a not just a guest, but a good friend, J. Warner Wallace, which is an official title that
you
people
only
use.
invited me because you couldn't get Susie. I know the truth, okay? You wanted Susie.
That's true.
We wanted both of you. Actually, we wanted both of you. But Jim, we're gonna call you Jim. We're not going by J. Warner.
Yeah.
We've known you as Jim for 20 years. We've done ministry together.
Yep.
We have slept on floors in churches together.
Sadly.
We have lost teenagers on trips together.
Yes.
And we served on the police force together. So,
Well,
oh no, that's the one thing we
like
did not do. It felt like.
Yeah,
no,
it did.
I think Jim arrested me a couple of times.
Yeah.
But no, we
Some of the best videos we have of those trips are the ones where you were we were pranking kids while they were sleeping. It was the best.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think some of the best memories are just pranking the students.
Yeah.
I mean, that brought us the most joy as leaders.
Yeah. And Brett used to write songs. You don't do that anymore, do you?
No.
For the groups?
No,
There's too many kids in the groups,
yeah.
I think is why.
Yeah.
But we would have like 15 or 20 students and you would pick maybe 4 or 5 and you would write a song, a customized song.
Oh, yeah.
That always involved the same chord.
Yeah.
One chord just played
That's right.
over. It's all you knew was one chord.
Yeah, that is all that.
But they loved it. Oh my gosh. I still have video. I should have brought video tonight.
You still have that video?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, well,
I keep everything.
Please don't post that.
You know what? I will not post it for a price.
So we need to give people context of why we sometimes all of us were on trips together in Utah and Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
So give a little context to that.
Yeah,
voice.
well, I'm just thinking as people are hearing this, hopefully you're hearing the deep camaraderie and fellowship that we have with the Wallace family because we've done a lot of ministry together.
Yeah, I first met you because I was working as a youth pastor, and the first graduating class at this church I took over as a youth pastor, all but one of them, by the time we were done with the Christmas break of their freshman year in college, they walked away from the faith. And I thought, okay, whatever we're doing, it's terrible, and we can't continue to do this. So I just shifted it and kind of relied on how I got saved, how I examined Christianity, and I said we're just going to make a case for this over a 4-year period. You're going to get the whole case, and that's when I brought you in for a summer camp, which we did in Lake Havasu. Do you remember that camp?
That's right. That's right.
It was brutally hot, and you spent we did an 80s. That weekend we did like an 80s dance. Everyone had to dress up in 80s clothing. Do you remember that? I'll never forget that. Anyway, but that was the first kind of touching base with making the case to students. And then that next year, we did our first trip to Salt Lake City with you, which you had done before from when you were a youth pastor in Colorado. And then we started looking for a way to help students respond to atheism. And that's when we said, hey, let's take a trip like this, but let's do it to Berkeley. Because that was where 2 of the students that I had graduated walked away from their faith.
Well, we actually did Utah twice, and these are the immersive experiences that now Maven leads groups of students on. But we started these 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I think the first trip we took with you was 2004. And it was actually because you guys, your youth ministry had a Eastern European mission trip that fell through.
Right.
And you said, hey, let's try this Utah idea that you've been talking to us about.
Well, we knew we needed to do something other. Like when you're in Southern California, it's all board sports, right? So if it's summertime, it's a surf camp. If it's wintertime, it's snowboarding camps. If it's a weekend thing, it's going to be skateboard parks. I mean, it's all boards. And I just saw that after about a year of that, I thought, I'm not here to arrange social events for my students. Because that's what it was. They would bring their friends and they would come because it was a fun weekend. Then I never see them again until the next time we would throw another fun weekend. So I said, we got to change all that. We have to have a purpose to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so we would train up to these events. And we also did a social justice type trip. We did a lot of things that I wanted to give them a biblical perspective. So Utah became the theology trip.
Yeah, and we did that 2 years in a row, and it was after that second year, you said, this is fantastic. The focus is on scripture and theology, and my kids are learning doctrine, but I also want to give them some philosophy and apologetics and teach them how to think. And that's when you threw out the idea, hey, Brett, take us to Berkeley.
And you're like, I don't have any infrastructure for Berkeley. I said, well, you got a year to do it.
Yeah.
Put it together.
And so we built that trip together. You guys were the guinea pigs.
Yep.
And we took students, and we saw how it lit students up to be challenged, to take them up to Berkeley, to put them in front of atheists, real live atheists. They weren't even in cages. I mean, it was, and to have students face to face engage them. And it's always funny to see, Christian young people who haven't had that kind of engagement before go into that, and they're very intimidated, but it challenged them like never before. They would then come back to us even more motivated to learn apologetics, to learn their faith, to learn the reasons why, and then to go back out and engage.
Yeah.
And then one of the things that, of course, happens is as they're engaging in these significant conversations, they're also getting opportunities to share the gospel.
Right.
They're getting to live life on mission for Jesus. I mean, living out the Great Commission. And what we find on these trips now that we do through Maven is that this is the first time most when students, high school students, even college students, they go on these trips, they will tell us, hey, this is the first time I've ever shared my faith. And they're scared to death. By the end of the trip, they're lit up. Yeah. Because this is the primary purpose of the New Testament church. And so that was kind of it. So you got us going on Berkeley.
Well, I think some of the assumption in the church is that we'll show our people how to do this. We'll encourage them to do this, but we'll never really get in the trenches with them and lead them in this area. Yeah. So you really have to do it. You have to, and we did this, I think, about a year after when I was no longer a youth pastor, because that church merged with another church. We started a Southern Baptist church plant, and we started it in our home. And we still did the immersive trips for the first year, because I really felt like we have to not just, let's say you guys, when you share your faith, do this, or when you share your faith, think about this. You have to really take them and do it with them. And once you've done it as a team together, it's a lot easier, I think.
Yeah.
In even conversations like this where you can talk, because you've done it, you've seen your leaders do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because a church will take students to build a house in Mexico or run a VBS somewhere. So it's not like adults were not willing to do that. It's just these kinds of trips and just the whole growing in our knowledge of the Christian faith, but then the knowledge of other beliefs that are all around us. And then for the adults to take them and say, hey, we're not afraid to have these conversations. That is what seems to not be happening in churches like it should.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it too is that we did a lot of those too. We did a lot of those trips where we're serving, just flat serving, and we still wanted to do that, right?
Yeah.
But we wanted to show, like, what do we, when we are called to help those who are in need, what does that mean from a biblical perspective? Because I think it's just too easy for us to kind of throw some effort at it and walk away, and then we're done with it. So I think this is what we call tab training, right? So you have a trip that is really about immersing students in theology. That was Utah. Apologetics was the trip to Berkeley. Then you have to, at some point, talk about behavior. Like what, you can know all this stuff, but how does that change who we are? So we have to figure out, like, what's that be going to be? What are we going to, and a lot of that was where we would serve now. And we really try to address and think clearly about, if we spent a lot of time on Skid Row, because I happened to have a church planter who was there, who was a good friend of mine. And so we did a lot of ministry to the homeless, but we wanted to kind of look at it and say, well, what is this really? I mean, are we just going to throw money at it and say we felt good about it? Give them clothes and we felt good? No, we had to figure out, like, what are we trying to do with this group from a biblical perspective? And then you spend 8 weeks training before every one of these trips. That's the great thing. If you're a pastor, you're wondering what your teaching calendar is going to be. Well, it was driven around the trips. We did one in June. We did one in February. Then we just have the gap in between. And so that was when we do the set-free Skid Row trips. Yeah. So
I tell people, and I say this with all sincerity, that these trips, in terms of like youth programming, youth discipleship, these trips are the most powerful kind of life-changing thing I've seen. And I've been in, we were in youth ministry for years. We did kind of all of the camps, conferences, mission trips, inner city, on and on and on, and all have impact. But there's something about these particular trips.
Yes.
And I don't know how it informs you, Jim. I'm thinking about the parent maybe who's listening, or the grandparent or the youth worker who's thinking, okay, how does this kind of become a transferable concept or something to the discipleship of my kid? And because what we do often in the church and even in our homes doesn't look like this at all. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of sitting kind of at a desk, so to speak, sitting in a classroom, and that's what discipleship ends up being. And have you thought, like, are we like really off base here in the American church, or are there ways that we can just incorporate what you're talking about here, more of living this out together? Because I wrestle with that. Like, gosh.
Well, I think you and I have similar thoughts on this, because we both planted house churches at one point or another. So I don't know how much you want to say.
I want you to say whatever is on your mind right now.
No, you don't want me to do that.
I don't want you to hold back. We're all for, because we love the church.
No,
right?
I do too. And I've been a part of church staffs of huge churches, and I'm here in Southern California, in Orange County, and I've been part of smaller churches, church staffs, and then we planted a church through SBC. And so I love every form of church. But I will say this, there's a model we have that is a financial model in the church that really slows down our ability to do some of these other things. When I first started doing this, if we're going to take students to Berkeley, that's going to require us to take a number of parents, probably one parent for every 2 or 3 students. So we need a pretty big team. And if your lead pastor is of the opinion, well, you can't take that team because it's financially draining, or you're taking people out of the Sunday service where they typically give, and we can't afford to have them not there to give. I had that happen several times. So really, we don't want you to take those trips. Yeah. So when I planted the church, we planted a free church because I have a pension, right? So I mean, I had income. I was still working as a detective at the time. And so we took that financial component out. Well, now you're free to do all kinds of things. So I'm not paying a mortgage. I'm not worried about collecting money for a mortgage. I have no salaries. We're doing it, I just blew out the garage, as you know, and we did it in the house. So we didn't have, I called it free church. It was a house church because that was the only way I could do free church here in this part of the state.
Yeah.
But when I took the financial component out, well, now we can do anything. And we still want our students to give. My church was pretty young. It was all like college age students. So I still want them to give, but then I want to take them to local ministries. And we did a lot of local ministry stuff. And we would not meet that week. That week, instead of meeting, we would go serve. But that model of going and actually engaging, immersing in something, if you have a model where you have to pay a mortgage, you have to make salary, you have to do these things, it's much harder, right? Because I can't take it. And that's the other problem, is size. So if I've got a church of 50 and it's never going to be larger than 50, well, then you can do projects with 50 people. We did Berkeley and Salt Lake City with 50 people. That's a big group, but it's doable. But if the church is 1,000, I can't do it with 1,000. So there are some ways that the model of church you're in can make this actually seem like it's approachable, it's realistic.
Yeah, and that's where I think parents, our view is that parents are the primary disciplers of their young people. And so parents with their own kids can, I think, incorporate this kind of principle. Get out of the house as much as possible.
Well, this is something that's funny because you guys are huge Steelers fans. Okay, I know that because we're in the same fantasy.
And not only are we huge Steeler fans, the Steelers are the best NFL franchise in history. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Or they were, you mean?
No, that's an objective truth.
Yeah, okay. So my point though is that we do a better job, most of us as parents, because we don't think about like why is it all of your kids are Steelers fans? It wasn't because you sat down.
Because they love Jesus.
That's right, yeah. It wasn't because you sat down and you intentionally catechized them to be Steelers fans. They just caught what you were passionate about and what you probably spent a lot of time talking about. And before you know it, they knew the history of the Steelers because they learned it from you, but not because you sat down intentionally to do it, because it just comes out all the time. Yeah. Well, we do a better job of that than we do. So it's like we're looking for a program to do this with our kids from a Christian perspective, yet we don't need a program to do this with our kids from a sports perspective.
Yeah.
So what's the problem? So I think really it is if you're really super passionate as a parent, your kids have a better chance of catching it because it's all you're talking about. And I was geeked out on it because I was trying to lead as a youth pastor, and your kids are constantly listening to every conversation. You know, you guys would come over for dinner, or if Dirk or somebody else from our ministry would come over for dinner, that's all they were hearing. And so they understood what we were doing.
Okay, so we jumped into our conversation about ministry before what we actually love to do with our guests, which is to give a little background on you, Jim. Assuming that some of our listeners don't know who you are, and we're talking about parenting and ministry, and so maybe they think, oh, this is a guy who grew up in a good Christian home and grew up in the church, and so you had a lot of experience with ministry, but actually, Jim, you did not grow up in a Christian home.
I got involved because I was living in this area. I was 35. Susie had our kids in preschool before they were school age. And those preschools just happened to be Christian churches, not in this county, but in a different county. And so when they got into school, I think she was like, well, should we continue taking them to church? And I'm like, well, if you want. I mean, I didn't grow up in church, and I didn't have anybody in my family who was a Christian, but my dad's like me. If I love Susie, I'll do whatever you want to do. I can go as a non-believer. My dad's been doing that for his entire life. So I can do that.
So your dad has gone to church with his wife, you're saying?
Well, yeah, not like me. He would go as often as he had to go.
Okay.
But that would be it, right?
Okay, so one thing I wanted to ask you though, because you and Susie got married young.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that today and thinking we've been friends for probably 20 years, and I've never asked, okay, you grew up in, your parents got divorced. It wasn't a Christian home. But you married young, and
we didn't marry as young as we started dating. So we dated for a long time before we married.
Dating.
Yeah.
That's right. I just feel you and Susie have been together forever. I mean, you were 16 or 17.
I was 17. She was 15.
And they're about to celebrate 70 years.
No.
I think we should
so funny.
give them a round of applause.
They are not.
Did you notice though?
How dare
don't
you,
even
Brett.
start dogging me on this, okay? Because at least I don't try to shave off every gray hair I have on both sides of my head, okay? Like some people I know.
You outed me. That's my strategy.
Yeah, it's working.
So you have been committed to Susie since you were 17 years old. And I was thinking today, that's pretty remarkable, considering the home you grew up in. And, you know, most of us Christian parents we want to model marriage for our kids. And obviously that's important to do. How did you and Susie meet so young, marry? I mean, you were younger when you got married. And you two are some of the most, I mean, when I think of committed marriages, you and Susie are at the top of my list.
No, that's very kind.
How was that cultivated in you?
Well, I think all of us, and now we do a lot of marriage resiliency with police officers who are involved in critical incidents. And so we've been doing that for about 4 years with Billy Graham Association. So we see how much we bring into our marriage from how we are raised. It's impossible not to. Every one of us brings in something to our marriage that we either learn from our parents or we are reacting to our parents. We're doing one of those two things. We're either modeling what they modeled for us, or we're saying, hey, that was terrible. I'm not doing that. And so for me, that's what it was. It was the second. And we've done a bunch of weddings. You just got done doing Micah's wedding. So, and I say this a lot when I do a wedding, is I will say you have to love marriage more than your spouse. And I do love marriage more than my spouse. But I want the kind of marriage that's great, fantastic. And so she benefits, I hope, from my love of marriage. But I love marriage because I didn't know God until I was 35. So my God was marriage. Because my parents and you can make an idol of marriage. That's not always a good thing.
Yeah.
But that's what it was for me. So that's why we were very intentional about this relationship. I really believe that I just did a book on this. There's the metrics on marriage, the studies that have been done on marriage, and early marriages are just phenomenal, the way that humans flourish if they take marriage seriously. I truly believe that if there was no gospel of Jesus Christ to change or impact culture, the very next thing that would right the ship for us would be intact traditional marriage. Marriage is that powerful. It's why it's an image of the church, right? It's that powerful an institution.
Well, and this is why it's included in the first command that God gives humanity, right? Be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
Get married, have families.
Yeah, it begins with the marriage and it ends with the marriage. So I think this is something that we have to take seriously, and I took it seriously even before I knew God. But my kids would not stay in Sunday school, so I'd never been in a church before. Now my kids have been in preschool, so we go to this big, huge church. I mean, thousands of people, and they have like affinity groups for the kids go here and youth goes there, and well, they didn't want to sit in this church. So after I was there for a little while, I just started sitting in Sunday school with the boys because they wouldn't sit. They want to go in big church. I thought, I'm not getting anything in big church. I'll just sit. You go this week, I'll go next week, and we'll kind of flip back and forth. Well, if you sit very long in any children's ministry, someone's going to ask you to volunteer in children's ministry. And that's what happened. So I was volunteering at first, and then they hired me as their coordinator of 5th and 6th graders, which was hundreds of students. And I did that for 2 years as my kids were in 5th and 6th grade. And then when they were in junior high, we went to a different church, and I became the youth pastor there. And I just followed them up. Not that I would. And during that time, I started attending Gateway Seminary. I thought I should probably get a seminary degree, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And then I got injured on the job, and I thought, I'm going to lose my job. I'm not going to be able to finish my career as a police officer. And I was working in detectives when I got injured, and I almost retired out and became a pastor. But while I was injured in light duty, a friend of mine, she had a cold case that she hadn't looked at. We're kind of doing these collaterally. We would kind of tinker with them. And I had a couple also, but I wanted hers. So I was injured. I was light duty. I went over and I solved that case, and that started a 10-year run of working cold cases. So that injury, it was either going to put me in ministry or put me in cold cases. It ended up putting me in cold cases.
I'm kind of laughing when you're telling this story about your kids didn't want to stay in Sunday school, so you just went with them. And because you were kind of a new Christian, it's almost good that you didn't know.
Oh, I had no idea.
It's like you didn't know, if you hang around long enough, they're going to give you a name tag and say, hey, you're in charge of these kids over here.
That's right.
Which is just so
funny. And I said
funny.
to them, I told him, I said, I don't know anything. I've been here like 10 minutes. He says, well, we have curriculum. You just have to be 1 week ahead of these 8-year-olds. I'm like, well, I can probably get ahead of them 1 week. And that's what I did. I was reading just to get ahead of 8-year-olds 1 week.
Yeah. Which we have that's kind of sad also too, that this is the state of Sunday school in America.
But here's a good thing about it. The good thing about it was that if you're only ahead of your 8-year-old by a week, you're probably able to communicate with that 8-year-old because you have about an 8-year-old understanding of it yourself.
Yeah.
So it made it easier for me. And I think sometimes it gets harder, right? If I was like now, if somebody asked you, can you communicate this to an 8-year-old? You got to really think about how you're going to voice it.
Yeah.
Back then I didn't have to. I just read this last week.
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat what I heard. So it makes it a little bit easier, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because when Brett and I started dating, I was a single mom. I was a new Christian. And then we're both Biola students. And then he starts saying, hey, come volunteer at my youth group, And I'm thinking, I've only been a Christian like 2 years. And I'm in my Bible classes, I'm learning. And he's like, it's fine. You just come and learn with the kids. And I think that's right, because those times in junior high ministry, I just had to stay a little bit ahead of the girls, but I grew so much because I was kind of wondering some of the same things they were wondering about as far as theological questions and why and stuff like that. So that is true. And that's why sometimes having new believers in our midst, just maybe constantly is good for us to do, especially now that we've been believers for a long time, because then you're reminded of that.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes too, we can overthink it. I don't know if you felt this way, but when I was a new Christian, I remember it took me about a year to really examine the Gospels before I was convinced that maybe we should take a step in this direction. And Susie was waiting patiently for that, but she saw I was obsessed. So I think she was probably, for her, she doesn't have the same high bar that I had. I mean, I think she felt like this seemed right to her and it seemed true. And she didn't have to go through every little detail that I wanted to go through to be convinced of that. Sometimes I'd find something, I would show it to her, and she would be like, "Okay, like that's really impressing you." You know what I mean? Like that little thing is important to you, but it's it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's 1,000 little things I needed to check off my list. And I remember when I got done with all of that, I started talking to other people in church, and now I'm in, and I'm reading like in Romans, and I'm struggling with this chapter, and I'm asking my Christian friends who have been Christians for 10 years or more, and I discovered that, to be honest, we don't often think deeply about what it is we believe as a group. And of course, we're preaching to the choir, because if you're coming to a conference like this, you probably are thinking deeply about what Christianity teaches and whether it's true and how you could communicate that to others and how it's going to impact your own life and the life of your kids. But I am saddened a little bit. When I would share these things I was discovering, and it seemed like I was showing them something that they had never considered before. I think we got to do a better job. I mean, I still talk to a lot of young people, and I think what they're discouraged by is, one, they don't get answers, and it feels like they're talking to people who don't really have answers, or maybe never even considered it. And then you're thinking, well, then, see, you don't even know it's not true. I don't think it's true, and here's why. And when I share that with you, you never even heard of that. So that's why you're still here as a Christian. You're not even aware of what is untrue about Christianity. Yeah. I think we at least need to be aware what the questions are. And I think the other thing that's changing is, and I'm sure you guys talked about this, but this is why when you formed Maven, you were really thinking about it, is I don't think the question is really, is it true anymore? I think the question is it good? And so I think we want to be able to articulate that it's both true and good.
When you say you don't think that's the question, you mean the question that young people are primarily asking?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's kind
when
of,
you say it's true, they're going to say, well, I'm glad you think so. I'm glad it's good for you.
Yeah.
Because everything is so subjectively grounded that when I say it's true, they're not hearing it like, no, this is an objective fact, like this is a table.
Yeah.
They're thinking of it like, well, I'm glad that works for you.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter if it's true for you. It's just not true for me.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want it to be true for me because it's not good. It's the source of every bad ism I can think of.
Yeah.
That's what they're thinking.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the difference between a felt need and a real need. Because, right, so maybe more of the question they're asking has to do with the things that they are feeling or thinking, and so they're saying that, you know, whether Christianity is being demonized or blamed for this, or it's bigoted for this view, and so they're now under these cultural conditions asking more of the is it good question. And at the same time, though, we'd want to say there is a human nature that is fixed and unchanging that we also want to keep in mind. And so you're not saying, hey, throw out the truth question and let's just deal with this one.
No, right.
You're saying it's both.
Yeah.
Because we'd say those are tightly
They're connected, yeah.
Right. But kids and adults are rational by their very nature. And so we don't want to set that aside, even though this is where, and I say that because I see sometimes, I think in the church, we run to these trends, right? We see, here's the, you saw this back in the early 2000s with postmodernism and the emergent church.
You're seeing it again now with progressive Christianity.
Yeah, you're seeing it now where there's a run to all kinds of different things.
Well, okay, so here's what I see. This controversy that occurs, they've been running these ads on He Gets Us ads for forever. And I think as a church, we're kind of divided on whether we love these things or hate them. And it seems like it's pretty visceral on both sides. Do we love them or do we hate them? And I think for me, what I see in Scripture is that to love like God loves is really hard. And nobody can do it because we're not God. And you see on the pages of Scripture, it's from the Old Testament to the New, that the nature of God is always described as the fullness of truth and grace, justice and mercy. And God is love, and that's really what it is. It's about how do I do both of those things? Because we have a tendency to think of love as just the mercy side, just the grace side. Right. Truth is the hard justice side. No, actually, it's that fullness. So when John says in the first chapter of his gospel that Jesus arrives in the fullness of truth and grace, he's what he's saying is, you realize this is God. Only one being in the universe as fullness of truth and grace. That's God. The rest of us, all of Scripture is like, hey, you guys need to be more gracious. You're not loving enough. Or, hey, you need to be more discerning. You're letting anybody do this. So it's always this balance, and we're trying to balance those two. So I think for me, a lot of it is, if we're going to express the love of God, it has to be balanced in fullness of truth and grace. And I think sometimes we see like a commercial like He Gets Us. It's all grace. But is the gospel going to be preached? No. So I'm of the opinion if we can't do both, then we're not loving like God. We shouldn't do either. If all we're going to do is preach justice and no grace, we should probably back up until we can do both. And if all we're going to do is preach grace, but no gospel, no truth, no justice, no dealing with sin, then we probably should back out until we can do both. I'm not sure you can do both in a 1 minute or a 30-second advertisement. Yeah. But you're going to fall short. And I think we have to kind of, that's also true, I think, for other, when I'm explaining the truth of Christianity to young people, I've got to be able to balance those two things. So its truth is going to be important, but goodness is going to be also equally important. Because look, there's a truth about, did Hitler exist? Yes. Were there certain principles to Nazism? Yes. So there's some truths there I could claim, right? But it's not good, so why even bother? We have to be able to show that this is both true and good.
Yeah, and I think as parents, I think what you're saying about the truth and mercy, the balance, but of course it's connected and it has to be. I think as parents and people who are in marriages, we do understand you cannot separate truth from mercy, from love. It's not meant to be separated. And when you do, it's a disaster. But that's what, we're talking about other modern areas where it's being pushed, but in parenting is one of those where the modern parenting advice is, I don't want to say gentle parenting because there is an actual curriculum that's gentle parenting, but it's just full of mercy parenting and the truth is lacking.
Right. So you're not loving then. That's the problem.
So it's not actually loving.
Because it's those two things in balance that's the nature of God. And you see this both in the Old Testament where it says that justice and mercy, as God's justice and mercy kiss. These are claims that these have to be held. And it's not like God is taking out of the scale. It's that He holds them both in fullness, and that's why the scales are balanced. So we have to do that. How many times have you heard someone say, well, yeah, I don't want to, I've got this couple I'm trying to mentor, and they're living this way, and it's not really a Christian lifestyle, and I'm just trying to keep the door open by being so gracious and merciful. Well, are you ever going to share the truth, though? What I see most of us is like, yeah, we're leaving that door open, but we're never going to share the truth. Then you're not balancing truth and grace. And that one side is destructive, and so is the other side in isolation destructive. Yeah. You've got to do both.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm curious, Jim. Okay, so your kids are grown up, out of the house.
Now we have grandchildren.
Now you got grandkids.
In the house.
In the house.
Yes.
It's 4 days a week.
It's awesome.
She comes over.
Yeah.
Yes.
So now from that perspective, is there anything you look back on that you did with your kids and you say, man, I'm really glad I did that in terms of their discipleship, passing on the faith, apologetic training, anything you look back and go, man, I'm really glad I did that?
A couple of things. I think that our parenting has always been grounded in our marriage. So I think the one thing we've done is we've loved each other well. And in that environment, our kids grew up. And so that commitment I make to Susie and she makes to me, I think our kids knew it. I think part of it too is that I got saved very late. Not really late, but I was 35. So as my kids were in their 20s, if they were kind of sideways on an issue, it never shook me. I'm like, at that age, have you just seen me? He's got a lot of years before I got to start worrying about it. So I had an open hand with that. And so I was pretty patient. I've got one son who's an anesthesiologist, and he was in biochemistry as an undergrad. And there were some years there where I don't think he was interested in God. Now, he knew, though, he'll tell you that he knew from all the stuff we did with DNA and making the case, he wasn't going to leave. He knew there was a God, but he just was not interested. Well, now as I watch him, he's how active he is in his church and what he's doing, I'm like, this is... So I could have, I suppose, made what at the time could have been troubling for me. I could have made it worse. But I thought, no, this is part of his journey. I'm patient. And he knew I was patient. I wasn't like hitting on him all the time. Why aren't you in church? You can find a church. I didn't do that. I just let him journey through this because I knew that I was part of my journey. So I'm glad that we didn't overreact at times when we could have, right? In those seasons where maybe you're wondering, are your kids even interested, right? Yeah. And now both of them are contributors at our website. They kind of like Micah, they're in the game. Yeah. And it's been awesome to see that.
So now list the top 5 things you did wrong with your kids.
I can give that. I think actually the arc of parenting includes a point in your parenting life where you have great remorse over all the things you did wrong. I don't know many good parents that don't have a season in which they look at something that went sideways, because it's unless you have no kids. But we have 4. If you have 4 kids, that's enough kids to see something go wrong. Yep. And that's going to happen. And you're going to have that season when you're like, wow, I wish I could have done that differently. Here's what I know is hard for parents that I see now as a grandparent. It's really easy for me to be present in both body and spirit with my granddaughter, because I just said, okay, we're not traveling anymore. We're not doing speaking of, this is local, so here I am with you guys, but we're just going to turn all of that off so that we don't have to go anywhere or do anything, and we're going to be present. I could never do that as a parent. I had to make a living, and I was never home, it felt like, because it seems like everyone wants to kill each other on holidays. So it's like, you have Christmas coming.
And you mean literally.
So you mean
literally.
as a cop you had to work on
If you're working
holidays.
homicide, you're going to get called out on Christmas.
Oh,
You're going to get called. Any holiday that puts family together, that's like a murder day, okay? So you're not
That is the most depressing
No,
thing
it's true.
I've
I used to
ever
hide.
say.
I remember one Christmas I was on my front porch putting together a foosball table. I had not been home in days. And sure enough, I get a call out. There's a murder. And I'm like, I'm not going to answer that phone. They can take me off the team for all I care. I'm putting together this foosball table. I just hid on my front porch. But I think that's looking back at it, I would say, I regret that there was seasons, which probably needed to be, in which my first priority was something other than my family, because and you can argue, well, this is for your family. Well, you could argue that, but the reality is you're not home. And when you are home, you're thinking about this thing that you're going to get a call on. So
yeah. Well, you and your wife, Susie, you guys have put together some really great resources. And I just want to make sure that our parents who are listening are aware of some of your resources. So tell us first, you've got a new book coming out entitled The Truth in True Crime. So give us a little overview, give us a preview of that, and then tell us about some of the other resources you have for parents and kids.
Well, this new book is just basically 15 stories from our casework that reveal 15 attributes of human nature. We're going to talk about one of them tonight that I thought was kind of interesting and surprising at the time I discovered them, but they're all really biblical. So this basically is 15 crime stories, 15 kind of rules for living, and 15 pieces of evidence to build a case for the reliability of Scripture, all in one book. But what we did for students, and we knew we have 2 more we're working on this year, 2 more books for kids. They're like the 8 to 12 range, because this statistically, where it used to be that 85% of Christians became Christians by the age of 18. That has been declining dramatically over the years. There's some data that would suggest it's closer to 12, that if you're not a Christian by 12, if you're not committed in your worldview by 12, there's a good chance you won't be. That's sad, but that's because usually we give our students cell phones by the time they're 13. So you've introduced your students to the world and all the skepticism that's in the world. So we knew that age range was going to be important. So we have a case, we have all of the first 3 books that we wrote a kid's version. And we have a Casemakers Academy, casemakersacademy.com, where you can go through these academies and earn a certificate. I just saw on Twitter today that a class had just finished doing it and all earned their certificates. But the idea here is just kind of get you thinking. And to be honest, I sometimes think those students are really more interested in solving the mystery in the book than they are about developing these reasoning skills. But they're going to have to develop those reasoning skills to solve the mystery, so
Yeah.
we're okay with that.
That's what comes along with it. Yeah, our younger kids have been able to go through your and Susie's books because our other kids were too old by the time you guys wrote them. But I love that you are thinking about that age group, because that age group is starting to ask questions, and it is good to start to teach them how to think well. And that's what you guys do in the book through a mystery that they solve. So our kids have loved it and made folders out of it and put all their stuff together. So
I remember
they're
doing an
great
event in
resources.
Mississippi, and a youth worker came to me, a children's worker came to me, and she said, I want to show you the difference. I was so shocked by the difference between fourth graders and sixth graders. In my fourth grade class, the question is, why would Satan do it that way? In my sixth grade class, the question is, why do you believe in Satan? Subtle shift, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what we're seeing. And it happens in a very upper elementary. So I think we need to be focused on upper elementary.
Yeah. Well, if people want to find you, like physically, if they want to visit your house, can you give the address? Oh no, if they want to find you online, Jim, where can they
anyone's
look?
a secret. Like you can't find anyone you want to find for $15. Yes, you could probably do that. But you can find us at coldcasechristianity.com.
And is that where they'll also find the Casemaker Academy?
Yeah, there's a link in the sidebar for it. Yeah, because I just feel like that's important work for us to do. We're doing 2 more books with Zondervan this year, and we're just trying to help people, help students think critically and apply that to the Christian worldview.
Yeah. Any parents who are listening who have 8 to 12-year-olds or somewhere in that range, that those resources are really great. The books are great, and then using that website, great resources for the
And we know
kids.
you guys homeschool. We did too. So we saw that as a resource for homeschoolers.
Yeah. Yep, for sure.
Well, Jim, time flies by. I mean, 45 minutes, and we're already at the end of this, and it's because we have such a great friendship. We're like-minded. We've done ministry together. And and you're a pretty interesting guy.
Not really. Susie's interesting though. We get her here.
This is how I'm going to end it.
Yeah.
No, actually, this is a privilege in that we get to interview one of our good friends who we've done ministry with, who we know. Like we've gotten a peek behind the curtain of this guy's life. He's the real deal, and so we want to encourage you, go to coldcasechristianity.com, get his resources. And just Google Jim's name. He's all over.
Most of the stuff you'll find, if you Google it, that could be dangerous. So,
well, Jim, thanks for being part of our
thanks for having me.
podcast.
Appreciate you.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.